I think we are already a big group. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Yeah, Martin, maybe I give it up to you to start.
Yeah, if we're ready, you think everyone's joined. Anyway, you'll let people in if they're a little bit.
I'm checking that part, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so warm welcome to everybody. This is the first of a series of updates on the European Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. So there's another couple of meetings later on in the week that you'll be notified about. We have been notified about. I'm very pleased you can join us, and thank you very much in advance for all the efforts you do for the European Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. It's been a busy few years for everyone, I think, and there's really quite a lot to report. So it's really nice that we can all get together, maybe not in person, but at least over the screen, and give you some updates on where we've got to. So today we've got about an hour scheduled, and there's 3 talks, and then we'll have some questions. So if you've got questions, I would just save them up. I will put them in the chat, and we'll get round to them after the 3 talks. So there's 3 short talks, starting with David Roy. So David, do you want to take over now and share your screen and give us, well, this is just, I think, an overview of the Spring project and where we've got to with eBMS.
We can see your screen. Yeah, nice.
You can see it, okay.
Okay, we can see that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for organising, particularly Christina, who's put a lot of work into planning this week. Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I'll this will be a bit of a whiz through some slides. And I wasn't quite sure who was at the Spring final conference, so there's a bit of overlap with some of the things we covered there. But I'm going to come back specifically to what Spring means to the eBMS, which might stimulate some discussion, hopefully. So yeah, so I guess most people are reasonably familiar with this Spring project that we've talked about several times, but just for those for whom this might be quite new, there's some work was done mostly during COVID, actually, to come up with a proposal for what an EU pollinator monitoring scheme should look like. And this diagram is quite well known now, I think, that came out of that report led by Simon Potts, but involving a lot of experts across Europe, and recommends a series of activities to cover the range of pollinating insects. So not just about butterflies, but particularly to cover bees, hoverflies, potentially wider biodiversity. And it recognizes that different methods are suited to different taxa, and different methods provide different measures in terms of species abundance and diversity. And remember that the sort of goal of an EU pollinator monitoring scheme is to understand both diversity and abundance of pollinating insects, and particularly measure trends and reverse the declines of pollinators. The sort of legal side of this is still playing out, but that's ultimately what the scheme is trying to do, is provide robust trends on the range of pollinating insect groups. So there was a big report published which went into a lot of detail about methods. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but we all know, as most of us, I think, are entomologists, ecologists, know that there's various ways of sampling insects. So this report looked at trade-offs between the quality of the data produced in terms of abundance or occupancy, what sort of biases and limitations there may be with different methods. Also importantly, which methods are feasible to be used by citizen science approaches, recognizing the value that brings in terms of involvement of a wider community of participants, but equally some methods are very dependent on professional input for both sampling and particularly processing of samples where there's identification challenges, which is certainly the case for many bees and hoverflies, for example. And clearly this needs to be affordable, so cost was also a key consideration. And the upshot of all that work to look at methods was that for the minimum viable scheme, as it's called within the EU pollinator monitoring scheme, is the sort of core methods that were recommended. And there were 2 recommended approaches. The first of which is transect walks, which is very familiar to us as people interested in butterflies. It's our primary method for monitoring butterflies. And it's effectively what's called a passive method. So you're not attracting insects into a location. You are walking a standardized route and counting the numbers of each species seen. So for butterflies, this is the primary method, but it's also been extended by the Spring project to cover the other pollinating insect groups, bees and hoverflies. I won't go into huge detail on this, but there was quite a lot of thinking and testing as to what was the best approach for monitoring bees and hoverflies, given the taxonomic challenge of identifying them in the field. So we tested some approaches where we looked at counting to major groups, but also in the latter part of the Spring project, we also looked at methods to record bees and hoverflies to species level by collecting collecting some individuals to then identify in the lab. So that's the sort of standard, that's a transect approach that was piloted versus Spring. And the other major approach was water traps or pan traps, which are termed an active method because they are effectively pretending to be flowers. So they're attracting insects to a trap, so effectively killing insects within a trap to then take that sample back to the lab and do identification, etc. So particularly for pan traps, there's a mix of volunteers can be involved in terms of setting the traps, but the identification of the material and the sampling processing is typically done by lab technicians, etc., which can be a bottleneck in collecting that data. And because pan trapping is an active method, competing with flowers, there's quite a lot of literature sort of looking at how it then samples the environment when it's competing for flowers in the environment. So you can get effects such as in very flower-rich environments, you actually get a lower catch of insects in your pan traps. So pan trapping was seen as very much providing a measure of occupancy, given these concerns over potential biases and confounding factors. So the Spring project was one of its main activities was to test this minimum viable scheme at scale. So the first sort of pan-European test of some of these methods, given that to make design decisions about a scheme for the whole of Europe, we really need experience and data from across Europe. So I'm really grateful to many of you on the call who've been involved in this in various different ways, but we organised ourselves regionally, and the Spring project was providing what I think of as a sort of an end-to-end pilot of these methods, how you get material together, how you find people to contribute, both volunteers and professional staff, undertake the field sampling, undertake the lab work, enter data, and standardize it for analysis, etc. So a lot of components that we were testing as part of these field trials, and we're busy sort of reporting on that for the Commission now that the Spring project has ended. And to give a bit more life to this in terms of the methods, this was the primary way that we were testing the methods. So it shows an example site with the dots being the location of the pan traps, and then a transect through the middle of the square. And this was a 500-meter transect with subsections 10 by 50 in the first year, and then there was some that were 100-meter long in the second year, and some sampling throughout the season, but crucially at less frequent sampling compared to the eBMS. So this was typically monthly or every 2-week sampling. And then we also were piloting how to enter the data. So we had a oh, sorry, I don't know why that text in the middle of the slide. We had a system for collecting the data that was linked to other systems and crucially linked to the eBMS system. So the data was entered through the pollinator monitoring scheme, but the data was made available to the eBMS partners. So in terms of a few sort of example results, so the Spring project did field sampling over 230 sites across Europe. with over 1,100 days of sampling effort. So a huge amount of effort across the EU to test these methods. This shows the breakdown over time and by different countries. So we didn't really start because of various delays until the middle of 2022. And not all countries were able to start in 2022. So we had more countries involved in 2023 and a longer span of sampling, reflecting that the season is longer in some parts of Europe than others. And in terms of high level numbers, in terms of how we were sampling the overall diversity of groups across Europe. So in total, around over 500 species of bee were sampled either by the transects or the pantraps, which is around a quarter of the overall EU list. For butterflies, quite good coverage in terms of number of different species sampled, about half the EU list. And hoverflies, again, around 200 species and about a quarter of the list. So lots of data collected across butterflies, bees, hoverflies, and also assessments of plant communities. And so, yeah, I think there'll be a lot of richer analysis of the data coming, but I'm going to give a few very general summaries now. So this map shows, forget the UK one, which is a test site, shows the coverage of sampling of the minimum viable scheme for the butterfly data across the EU. So certainly good coverage to be able to test how well the methods are working. And not surprisingly, given that these sites were not chosen specifically to be particularly diverse for butterflies, so they were trying to sample a range of sort of intensive to less intensive parts of the countryside. The most common species, as you might expect, were some of our common and widespread species across the EU, shown on the summary here in terms of the frequency of sites and the number of individuals sampled. And again, this is very summary level information in terms of a breakdown of effectively the average count from these sampling visits. This is the abundance figures showing box and whisker plots, which show the mean and the sort of range of numbers by different countries. And the very crude top level numbers is around 23 individual butterflies counted of around 5 species. So quite low counts, I think, which probably reflects the sorts of environments that were being sampled across the EU. And this shows a similar breakdown in terms of diversity, so number of taxa recorded. Again, yeah, relatively low numbers, I feel. But also illustrates there's quite a lot of variability between sites through the season, between countries, etc. And some of the key use of this data will be for the data to feed into power analysis assessments that's going to be done to help define or look at options for how this scheme can work in future. So that sort of leads me into sort of my final bit of the talk, really, which is to think about what happens next. So the spring project sits within, as I mentioned, sort of comes out of this assessment looking at methods through an expert group called Science and Technology for Pollinating Insects, the STING group, which came up with the initial report and came up with some recommendations. And the spring project is really in this phase of building capacity, piloting, refining methods. So the spring project is quite important for that, but there's also other projects looking at building up taxonomic resources. So there's these 2 projects focused on bees and hoverflies. And then what happens next is that this STING group is still continuing to look at options and will take the results of the spring project and look at design questions in more detail now they've got much better data from across the EU. And it's obviously linked to how the nature restoration law develops, but the plan is at the moment is to roll out sampling at the member state level based on the recommendations from the STING group which will look at issues such as what sort of indicators will be produced from this data, how we collect the data, what methods are used, and the resources to support it. So I just thought to final maybe to think about some questions that we might want to discuss further. So I think it's worth thinking about how, if the EU pollinator monitoring scheme takes off, how is this going to benefit the existing approaches in Europe, the eBMS, citizen science led projects? So I think in terms of positives, I think the EU POMs will provide a lot of capacity building. So that's recognized by the EU that there needs to be a lot of capacity building in terms of training and resources for people to take part. It will clearly raise the profile for insect monitoring. This is high-level political commitments, and it will be probably sampling places that we traditionally haven't covered with standardized with traditional transects. So it may help some of our biases that we have in the current data sets. And therefore, we need to work together, I think. So one way you can do that is the data will be pooled and analyzed in a single approach. And I think the approach that we've developed for the eBMS will fit the sort of data that's going to be collected from an EU pollinator monitoring scheme. And the advantage of the eBMS is that it can provide sampling throughout the season, so it can understand the phenology of species, which is an important part of the analysis. And the eBMS can more focus on involvement of citizen science approaches, coverage of rare species and important habitats, which won't be, I don't think, the target of an EU-wide pollinator monitoring scheme. Because I think the EU pollinator monitoring scheme will inevitably focus on the common and widespread species to give an overall measure of pollinating insects across Europe, with reduced seasonal sampling because of the costs involved. So in many ways, I think we'll be less sensitive and less comprehensive than the eBMS. So yeah, thank you very much for everyone who's contributed, and yeah, huge gratitude to all the coordinators and volunteers particularly. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was a good summary of a lot of work there. Thanks very much.